Hello everyone, welcome back to UnchartedX. This is Ben, and I'm very happy to say that I've got another podcast for you today with the one and only Randall Carlson. Randall is somebody who should need no introduction to regular viewers of this channel. I was very pleased to get the chance to sit down with him once again and get into a discussion about several different topics. We got into kind of a deep dive on the Carolina Bays, talked a little bit more about Randall's backstory. We got into some of the cosmological and mythological implications of comets and the astral bodies and what they mean for civilization and religion and stories. We even got into a discussion around climate change as well as the dreaded cancel culture. Should be a bit of fun for everyone who likes getting into those topics. I do want to say a massive thank you to Randall for, again, spending some time with me. I very much enjoyed our conversation. You can find more of Randall's work over on his channel, which is titled appropriately Randall Carlson. It's the home for his excellent Cosmographia podcast that he does with Brad and the Snake Brothers and Mike. It's a great show. I'd recommend it. You can also find his work hosted over on howtube.com. Randall is kind of a flagship account for Howtube, as well as on his website, which is randallcarlson.com. Those are all linked below, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. All right, well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm thrilled to say that I'm being joined once again by the great Randall Carlson of Cosmographia. Randall, it's great to see you. Thanks again so much for taking the time to talk with me.
My pleasure, Ben. It's great to see you again, too.
Indeed.
And I'm looking forward to hanging out with you again in the real world.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for the first time, we'll get to. I haven't met you in person, so and we'll get the chance to up in the Scablands in May. Yeah, I'm also very much looking forward to that.
Oh, wait a minute. We didn't meet in Egypt, did you? That was just a digital meeting, wasn't it?
It was.
I wasn't in Egypt when you were there. What am I thinking?
You were. Well, you did turn up on the on our television screen in my hotel room in Egypt. That was pretty cool. Yeah. Randall, for people that don't know, Randall was kind enough to spend a couple of hours talking with our tour group, doing a Q&A while we were in Egypt, and he had some time. It was something that was kindly organized by yourself and George Howard. Big thanks to both of you for that.
Good old George.
Good old George, yes. He emailed me the other day, actually. Yeah, looking forward to chatting with him again soon, too.
Yeah, so whenever we have our conference, we'll have to make sure that we invite George.
Definitely. Yeah, no, George is a good time, and he's very knowledgeable guy as well. Deep on the Younger Dryas. He's part of the Comet Research Group. I mean, he was part of that first paper in 2005 that got the whole
I knew about
thing
George
started.
At least a decade before I even met him.
Yeah.
I read that first paper by George, and I thought, I mean, we're talking, 98 or something. I read a paper, George Howard. Wow, this guy really is onto it. You know, maybe there's like 4 people in the world, I think, who are onto this, Younger Dryas impact idea. And hey, here's one of them, this guy, George Howard.
Yeah.
I wonder who he is.
Wow.
Who is this guy?
Man, I was thrilled when he rang me up, or he talked to me and said, "Hey, I want to come to Egypt," and he hadn't been, or he had been when he was a kid, and then he coming back, and he was just a great traveling companion too. He's a lot of fun, for sure. So yeah, hopefully we'll get the chance again at some point. That would be pretty epic.
Yeah, I remember being on a phone conversation with him, and he told me you were planning a trip to Egypt, and he was thinking about going. And he said, if I go, is there any place particular you would want me to go?
That's
just
right.
like I think you did. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, all of the play. I mean, obviously, the standards like Luxor and all of those places. But I said, go to the Temple of Hathor at Dendera and photograph that ceiling. Yes. Because, man, there are cosmic secrets splayed all over those ceiling and walls.
There really are. Yeah. In fact, that's a topic. We'll get into that. I do have a question about it because it's and in some ways it's that relationship of the zodiac and the sky. A lot of that stuff comes back from there as well. Like we have that represented in ancient Egypt as well, and we can get into that. And we kind of talked about it a little bit because you were kind enough to invite me onto your podcast, which I was on, I think, a few weeks back now, Cosmographia. So anybody that wants to know where to find more of Randall than you can handle, go and look at the Randall Carlson's channel, the Cosmographia. You guys do a podcast every week, pretty much. It gets released every week.
We record it every week, and it usually gets posted like 2 weeks after.
Right. Yeah, fantastic series of podcasts. I got to say, it's fountain of knowledge, and just the topics you cover in detail. I mean, it's impossible to get into that level of detail in like a 2-hour podcast here. You guys are sort of methodically working through topics, and I know you have a plan for how you're working through stuff, and I think that's it's great. I highly recommend people go and subscribe and watch your stuff there.
Well, thank you. And then, of course, now HowTube has rolled out, and
yes,
Cosmography has become a flagship website for HowTube, which is exciting. And I should actually show. Can we show people the?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, show us. Go ahead. Just do a screen share, and I will capture it. Because it's what's the address for that? It's howtube.com.
Howtube.com. There we go.
Hey, look at that.
Hey, how about that, eh?
Randall's live on HowTube.
Well, they hired a professional model for the homepage here.
That's great.
A lot of money. See, still figuring out how to navigate it. Oh, there we go. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
View Randall's channel. Hit that. That's so
okay.
you all of your on the front there, that View Randall's channel. I'm assuming that's all of your content is going to be hosted over there.
All of it. Yeah.
Okay.
So we go through. Yeah. People could learn about the whole system that's been. It's a pretty much cutting edge system here, and you can go through all the benefits, and there's going to be a lot of the things are responses to what's going on with the more mainstream platforms. So the idea is it's going to be curated, but it's going to be much more open to a lot of possibilities.
Right. So courses and learning and all this sort of stuff seems like it's happening. That's great.
Project.
Okay. And looks like it's launched, and I know there'll be a lot more coming out on that pretty soon.
There's tons more, but we'll just go to Randall's channel because we got, Mark After School is going to be one of the flagship content creators.
Yep.
Which is awesome. He does awesome stuff. So here now goes to the Randall Cut, and here you'll see the podcast episodes.
Yep.
Going down here. So look
at him.
Yeah, look at that.
It's a lot of content. I was going to say too, because the other place to find you have a couple of websites. It's randallcarlson.com and I think also cosmographia.com. That's like the best places to find you if people are looking.
It's randallcarlson.com will get you to everything. It'll get you to the Cosmographia podcast. It'll get you to HowTube.
Yep.
And
excellent.
Yeah.
And one thing to mention, because I've seen this on Twitter once or twice, is that you're not affiliated. There's because if people look for you on the web, they'll run into something called is it Sacred Geometry International, and I know that we talked about this earlier, but you're not affiliated with that. And I'd seen it also on Twitter because people think that's you on Twitter. There's also an official Randall Carlson on Twitter. It's not SGI. It's not Sacred Geometry International. I don't believe you're affiliated with them in any way, and certainly don't benefit from it in any way. Or make
I do not. I am not affiliated. I was.
Yeah.
And at some point in the near future, I'll get into why I'm no longer associated with it.
Okay.
For the time being, though, people need to know that any sales of my work there, I receive zero remuneration for it. So if you think you're going there and you're buying a class or a DVD or anything like that, or making a contribution, I see none of that money.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're looking for Randall's work, find it here at HowTube, your website.
Yes, and I will mention the Sacred Geometry course that's for sale on there is 10 years old, and it was never finished. And that's one of the reasons, amongst others, why I've pretty much... we are now creating a new Sacred Geometry course that probably will not really be available till early summer.
Okay.
But it's going to be kick-ass. That's all I can say.
I imagine it would be, yeah. Yeah, I think I've said before, like your old videos, like just that's just the amount of work. I think I said this in the last podcast, to have been in that room when you were like a lot of your older content when you're in the room with the people you were doing all the lectures and slideshows, just sort of working through these concepts in decades past. I think that would have been fascinating. I get a lot of enjoyment out of that stuff, and I'm sure that's the content that's going to be in these classes coming up. So
yeah, I like those old ones. Except, as I'm watching the old stuff from like 20 years ago, I'm going, I didn't have that right. No, I don't
Yes.
believe that anymore. But
Yeah.
or but overall, most of the content I think I would still stand by.
Right.
Most of it, yeah. I
Yeah.
think
Good.
anybody who's doing you know any kind of in-depth research for years, trying to come up with answers by sifting through a lot of evidence and data and so forth. You're gonna go off on some tangents. You're gonna go off on some dead ends. That's part of the process.
It is. Yeah.
And it's interesting though that I've seen something. One of the things I've learned since I've kind of taken this thing to the next level in the last 5 years, like in my affiliation with and friendship with Graham Hancock,
Mm-hmm.
I have seen some of the tactics used in the effort to discredit him and his work.
Right.
And typically, this is a very common thing. I'll see somebody go back to something he wrote 25 years ago,
Right.
which was almost more speculative, right?
Yeah.
But then dredge that up as if the fact that he was exploring something that, for example, didn't pan out 25 years ago, and that now discredits everything that's come since.
Yeah.
All the books he's written since then, and so on and so forth. So I've really become cognizant of that tactic being used by those who are defending agendas by trying to discredit things that would conflict with those agendas, if you
Yeah.
follow me.
No, I do. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I've seen the same thing too. I was
Sure.
very critical of the work that the basically borderline slandering him in I think it was the Journal of American Archaeology.
Yeah.
One of the trade rags that came out. It's John Hoops and a couple other people that put together a whole bunch of stuff that would pull up topics like that. I mean, as you say, and this is always a work in progress. You look at that's how science, that's how all these things work. Like even when you get into the things like the Younger Dryas. I mean,
Yeah.
25 years ago we didn't have any evidence for it other than the cultural evidence, the historical evidence, but it's not only since 2005, and that was after Hancock published Fingerprints of the Gods, the first one, that sort of explored this war. Not the first, but he really drove home the idea of a global cataclysm that affected humanity. We didn't have any evidence for it, and in that period since now, we've got 200 plus peer-reviewed papers. We've got some very solid science behind it, ideas evolve going forward. I know what you mean, and I'm the same. Like you start off with a bunch of ideas, and you refine your thinking and your ideas as you go forward. That's the nature of things. And yeah, I've seen the same tactics used where they'll pull up stuff, and he said, "Oh, he talked about ice, Earth crustal displacement or something from."
That's what I was just going to mention.
Yeah, and
in trying to come up with an explanation for what could have caused a catastrophe in Fingerprints of the Gods, he kind of went to the Charles Hapgood's work.
Yep.
About crustal displacement.
Yes.
And that work still, in my mind, has a lot of merit.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily going to be what he was surmising, that the entire crust of the globe shifts over. I don't remember his time frame, but it was pretty short.
Right.
And he excuse me, he sees the crustal shift as being the trigger of the cataclysm.
Yep.
I kind of lean towards a model where there is rapidly accelerated crustal displacement, but as a consequence
Of.
In other words, I've turned it around and said, well, part of the whole question of, when you have the deglaciation process, that involves a very rapid redistribution of surface mass.
Yes.
And a rapid rising of sea level. So there's a whole isostatic response in the planetary mass that results as a consequence of that, the deglaciation. And 6 million cubic miles of ice is going to be an extraordinary amount of weight. And when you redistribute that weight, I think there's consequences, not only to say even to the orbital stability of the Earth.
Right.
I think there's also ramifications in terms of the geomagnetic field, which I know is one of the things you wanted to talk about at some point, in terms of the shifting of the
Magnetic
of
poles.
geomagnetic north, for example.
Yeah.
I don't have a definitive answer on that, but the limited studies I've done would suggest to me that what we're seeing in effect is still its residual response to what happened during the Younger Dryas.
Yeah.
We're still seeing the after effects. The Earth is still trying to return to equilibrium in the aftermath of those events. Yeah. And as we become more and more aware of just how extraordinary and extreme and powerful those events were, it almost follows it. Yeah, it's going to take some time for stability and equilibrium to be restored to the system.
Yeah, it's a hard idea for people to, and for me as well, to wrap your head around it. It's that we tend to think in terms of in timelines. Really, we live for such a short amount of time relative to these geological and cosmic processes, right? It's we think, oh, it didn't happen in our lifetime or our grandfather's lifetime. Like it's like, these a concept of something that's taking millennia or tens of millennia to play out is kind of a hard idea to wrap our heads around. But you got to remember, I think that's we do context and frame a lot of our thinking about these things in terms of the length of human lifetimes and sort of how long time seems to us. But yeah, in reality, the whole Younger Dryas period was almost yesterday, geologically speaking. Like
exactly.
Our heads are still ringing from the blow, if you like. I think the planet's head is.
I think that's exactly right. And the thing about it is, though, man, you could say, well, it doesn't happen. It was not something that's happening during our lifetime, and yet it is something that did happen during somebody's lifetime.
Yeah,
it happened in a lifetime. I mean, those changes and those upheavals were perhaps in a shorter period of time as 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about. It really is. That would have been, and no doubt we lived through it. And this is the event that wiped out half of the large species of animals on the planet at the time, and we were part of that. And there's now all this evidence with the Y chromosomal bottleneck that shows that human populations were quite savagely affected across the planet. It's echoed down through cultures and religions. Like this was
absolutely
a serious event. And as we said, like this was something that prior to 2005 we only had that type of anecdotal, I suppose, or religious or cultural evidence for. This was these tales of catastrophism that come down through religion and indigenous wisdom keeping and all these different methods from cultures across the world. But as of 2005, we get solid scientific evidence that really starts to back this theory up. And it's one of the things that really drew me into this in the first place was the GISP data from Greenland, so the ice core samples. This was one of the first real indicators to me that, okay, this is solid proof that something went on. Because if you've seen that graph, and I'll make sure I put it in here, and I know it's in one of your slides.
Yeah, I got it right here. We can pull it up.
Sure, that'd be great, because that's that was sort of the start of this. It's you can see these massive temperature variations amongst other indicators, but temperature being and snow accumulation being one of them, all over the shop. Like if you can clearly see the Younger Dryas, but not just that period, but also before it. There was clearly a tumultuous time happening before it, and then post Younger Dryas. So after that, 11,600 years, we have that steady rise, and we kind of have a more or less stable system, stable climate that I think has given rise to our civilization and where we are today.
I look at that period. Early 90s was a very auspicious and significant time for me in my research and understanding, because when I really almost see a milestone point in my thinking about all this, the evolution of my thinking, was the first publications I'd seen of the oxygen isotope graphs of from the ice cores. Yep. That blew my mind, and I was already thinking about impacts at that point, because I got interested in the Carolina Bays in the late 80s. I think I read Henry Savage's book, The Mysterious Carolina Bays, maybe the year or two after it came out, which would have been maybe 87, 88.
Yeah.
So I was really fascinated by the Carolina Bays. I went I went with a one of the scientists on staff over at the Fernbank Science Center here in DeKalb County. He's at the time he was a PhD geologist working on his second PhD in geochemistry. Oh, okay. And I made several trips with him down to the fall line, which is just south of Macon, right at Macon, Georgia, where the Eocene-Oligocene boundary was exposed. Now, the Eocene-Oligocene boundary is the layer that the Georgia tektites are found. Okay. And the Georgia tektites are the result of the splash apron that fell back to Earth after the impact that has now left its crater on the bottom of Chesapeake Bay. Yeah. Roughly 35 million years ago, and also coincided with not one of the Great Five, but nonetheless a significant mass extinction event, which occurred right there. Right. So I was down there with him. We were hunting tektites, and nearby there were some Carolina Bays, and so he was aware of the Carolina Bays, and I got to know him because they have a publicly available science library at Fernbank Science Center that was just woefully underused. So they had it set up. The idea behind it was, well, we'll make this resource available to like the public or independent researchers or whatever, this science library. And in the late 80s, you didn't have digital downloads of papers like you do now. But what they did have was, they had the whole interlibrary loan network set up with dozens and dozens of university libraries and so on. So I started going in there regularly about 87 or 88 and research. I first went there because I had actually read a book about 5 or 6 years earlier called The Secret of Atlantis by Otto Mook, a German physicist. That was one of the earlier books I had read. It came out about 1980, I think, or maybe it was translated into English in 1980. And I was at that point like, so what's this deal with Atlantis? Was it real or not? Or, so I started reading a series of books about Atlantis. So Otto Mook's book was one of those that I read, and I thought, okay, I want to get it from the perspective of what do the scientists actually say about it, I did, of course, go back and read Ignatius Donnelly. His books from the 1880s, right, which were interesting. And interestingly, Ignatius Donnelly, if you've read him or you're familiar with his thesis, he attributes the cataclysm that destroyed Atlantis being the consequence of a cometary impact. Yep. Yeah, way back in 1882, 83. Yep. Okay, so I had read that. And, that's interesting idea, comet. And then I got a hold of Mook's book, and he had a chapter in there where he talked about the Carolina Bays. I thought, well, Carolina Bays, hey, they're right in my backyard. So then going back with Ed Albin and going down to look for the Georgia tektites, somewhere in the conversation, I said, you know anything about the Carolina Bays? And says, oh, yeah, there's some right down there near the outcrop we're going to be looking at, just south of there. So we made some trips down there and explored, and he collected samples from the rim of Carolina Bays, actually back then, and had them tested. Okay. And there was some stuff that showed up that looked like it was slaggy glass, and it was definitely argon. Argon dating showed it was too old to be industrial. Okay. Initially, when he had it tested, the professor, he was still doing his coursework in geochemistry. The professor said it was undoubtedly industrial. Yeah. But if it was industrial, there should be no argon isotopes at all, because I forget what the half-life of argon is, but it would have taken at least 10,000 years to show traces of argon gas. And guess what? It showed traces of argon gas. Right. So right there, that was when I went, impact possibly. And see, that's what Otto Mook was theorizing, that there was a breakup of a comet, and he cited several of the work, the earlier work, the controversy that went on between the celestial camp and the terrestrial camp.
For the Carolina Bays.
Probably familiar with that, Douglas Johnson was the leader of the terrestrials. And he concocted the complex hypothesis, which the complex hypothesis, Ben.
No, not specifically by that name.
Oh, it's the solution Artesian lacustrine Aeolian hypothesis.
Okay.
Could you repeat that after me now?
Atresian,
3 times really
Latresian. No, I fail. Just mark me down as a fail.
The Artesian solution lacustrine Aeolian hypothesis. It's basically everything in the kitchen sink to try to explain the anomalies of the Carolina Bays.
Yeah.
I mean, we could break it down.
Yeah, the wind. It's the wind, and it's all these other terrestrial processes put together that can potentially result in these bays. Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of that's the alternative explanation for them, or the orthodox, or what.
And the main problem with that, though, is you can't cite anywhere on the world today where you're going, okay, see, look, there it is. We see one forming right there. Yeah. We've been monitoring for 50 years now and see it's an incipient bay. We don't see that.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Right. And that's been the mainstay. That's been how a lot of geology has tried to explain a lot of these things, is like pointing at processes that are in place today. It's part of that swing against catastrophism and whatnot.
Yes.
In general.
So I actually went down there with a buddy of mine, not Dr. Albin, but somebody else who was also interested. So we went down and we hired a pilot and we flew over. This is about 90. No, it's maybe 89, right around in there.
Yeah.
Flew over the Carolina Bays. So I have photographs that I took, from the air of Carolina, the Georgia Bays. Now these are the Georgia Bays. And of course the works that I had read by Douglas Johnson, William Prouty, Shriver, anyways, the early authors, there was MacDonald, there was a number of these early authors, mostly focusing on the bays in North and South Carolina, right? Yeah. Which tend to be much more eccentric.
Right.
The
elliptical.
The ratio of the long axis, the major axis to the semi-minor axis, so they're flat and they're pretty elongated, right?
Yep.
But as you shift around and you come around to Georgia, the axis not only shifts direction, but the bays themselves flatten out and become much rounder.
Okay.
So I was very curious about that. So my interest in the bays goes back to the late 80s, right? It was triggered by reading this book by Otto Mook called The Secret of Atlantis, which and his whole thesis in that book, which I'm pretty sure was translated in 1980, was that there was a catastrophe that caused the destruction of an island civilization in the Atlantic, and the trigger of the catastrophe was an impact, and a cometary impact. And he went back to Ignatius Donnelly, I think, ultimately, and credited him with the idea. And in his model, the comet was breaking up as it came in, and the fragments came down, and his thesis was that the main core of the comet fell into the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And it was that impact that caused
Atlantis.
the seismic response that resulted in the sinking of Atlantis, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
of it.
So that's kind of where, that's where I really see an important phase of my concept of all this really kind of taking shape. Then the Greenland ice cores came out in about 92. Now, one other thing I should mention was that late at night, one night, I'm sitting there looking at maps. I've procured a whole bunch of U.S. Geological Survey maps.
Yeah. Right.
And I've got them spread out on the table, and I'm looking and I'm figuring, and okay, what's the orientation? And I'm seeing, okay, well, if Mook is right, then we have these depressions, elliptical depressions. They have prominent sand rims on the southeast,
right?
As if there was the force pushing them, right?
It was angular.
And so with the orientation of the bays themselves and the prominent south rims, the assumption is that the object, if it was an object, fragmenting, came in from the northwest. So I pulled out my maps. I got a map of North America, and I plotted in North and South Carolina, the orientation of the long axis is very close to 45 degrees northwest, southeast. Mm-hmm. So I just took my ruler and I laid on there and I drew, and it went up right over Canada, and that line led right up to the Arctic coastal plain of Alaska. And I drew that line, and I thought, okay, now if the Carolina Bays were formed 10, 11, 12, 13,000 years ago, if Mook is right, then the bays would have formed during the latter part of the Ice Age. So there would have been an ice sheet, an ice cap.
On top of that, yeah.
On top. So now I look back, I pull out some of the graphics that had already been done by that point, showing, and I actually can pull up the slides here in a minute to show the very ones I was looking at. Yep. And realize that the trajectory of the incoming objects would have brought it right over the ice sheet. So I'm thinking, okay, well now, is there any evidence of anything unusual about happening to the ice sheets, right?
Yeah.
Well, about the same time, I read another book by Cedric Leonard on Atlantis. I read about 5 or 6 books on Atlantis because I was trying to get the picture of whether there was any credible evidence there, or whether it was all just New Age silliness, or what was it. So the book by Cedric Leonard had a couple of things in it that were valuable. One, it had a chapter called The Catastrophe of 10,000 BC. So he's clearly, and this book is 78, 79, 80, something like that. I read it right around the time I read Mook's book, right? So that was one thing. And he marshaled some of the evidence there for, catastrophe in 10,000 BC, which would be 12,000 years ago, right?
Yep.
The other thing is he had several pages devoted to the Channel Scabland.
Ah, yes.
Now, this was the first time I'd heard of the Channel Scabland, but unbeknownst to me, and I realized then as I was reading about it, that I had seen it, that I had been there, that I had traversed it in the summer of 1970. When I spent the summer, traveling around out in the western states, the year after I was out of high school, and traveled down through the Columbia Gorge, which the whole Columbia Gorge, where it cuts through the Cascade, is just sculpted into these fantastic forms and deltas and strand lines and waterfalls and things that are all the product of these tremendously cataclysmic floods sweeping through there at the end of the Ice Age. So been through there, did that traverse down, coming back, came across, 94 in there, coming back across the Scablands. I was not too impressed because I didn't really know what I was seeing, although I just remember it was kind of a bizarre, kind of a lunar-like landscape.
Yeah.
But, back then, Ben, I was of the mind, I'm seeing these landscapes that are blowing my mind, and at that time, my framework of thinking was that, God, something's here, but there's no way I could ever know what it was.
Right.
There's no way I could ever understand what this is here.
Yeah.
That was 1970. 10 years later, I'm like, okay, I'm starting to form this picture, right? So I read Cedric Leonard's book. He had the section in there on the Scablands and the Missoula floods, these huge floods in Washington, and I'm going, oh, bingo. Yeah. 10 years ago, I was there and was across that landscape and didn't really know what I was seeing, but it impressed the hell out of me, particularly that traverse down to Columbia. That was just awesome. If you've ever done that through the Cascades there, the gorge where it comes through, that's a sight to behold. And then when you know the story behind the creation of those landforms that you're looking at,
it gives me chills now just thinking about it. I mean, because you just looking at that landscape and trying to imagine what happened.
Trying to imagine what happened.
Yeah,
So that was about the period where I'm thinking, okay, was there anything that happened? So I began researching, and I would do this. I would get into some stuff. Like when I was researching the Carolina Bays, I got Henry Savage's book, and he had a bibliography, and he even stated he was trying to get everything that there was written on the Carolina Bays up to that point, right? So I said, okay, my goal now is to read every single thing in his bibliography.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, the librarian there got really intrigued by my work. and my research. And she would be coming around, because I'm coming in here and I'm getting these old volumes and I'm sitting at the table pouring over this stuff. And sometimes there's nobody else in there. It's like I said, it was supposed to be a public resource. And here I come in, I'm one lone member of the public coming in, right? So I kind of got the treatment,
Yep.
A member of the public doing some research. Okay, this is what we're here for. So
purpose fulfilled.
Yeah. So 3 or 4 years I spent there, 3, 4, 5 times a week, get done with work, head over there. And I would come in with, some list of references. She would take it. It would go out onto the network 1, 2, sometimes 3 weeks later. Papers would come in, from the Netherlands, from your area, from who knows where, from all over the place. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I was getting all of this stuff and just pouring over it, and worked my way through most of Henry Savage's bibliography. So by the time I got to the end of it, I was pretty well convinced that the Carolina Bays were the result of a cosmic impact, right? And the analog that I found that I thought really explained it the closest in our modern experience was the Tunguska event of 1908.
Yes.
Yeah, of course, right. So so it went from there. So I would say that by 92 or 93, I was pretty much at that point beginning to think in terms, so let me just fill in one gap there.
Sure.
The question that rose in my mind was, is there evidence for something unusual or catastrophic happening to the ice sheet? Right. So that's when I began. Now I'd read through everything I could find on the Carolina Bays. Now I began really looking at everything I could find on the ice, the glaciers, the extent of the glaciers, the deglaciation process. That's when I started getting into the mega floods. I set out, got my bibliography of the Channel Scablands work, procured all of J. Harlan Bretz's work, poured through that. So by 1992, 93, I'm already beginning to think, I don't know if this makes sense, this idea of repeated outburst floods from glacier-dammed lakes, and thinking maybe we should be looking at the idea of an impact into the ice sheet.
Yeah.
So that's the idea I began to develop. And then in March of 96, I gave 5 lectures at Warren Wilson College, and they are recorded.
Okay.
And I'm spelling out the whole, basically, Younger Dryas impact hypothesis in that lecture.
Wow.
Talking about Tunguska as an analog for understanding it, the KT impact for discovering it, talking about the mass extinction, talking about the extreme meltwater floods. That was 96. So I've got that documented, and it's, like 6 hours of recordings.
Yeah.
So,
that's amazing. I kind of describe it that way too, because you have put together the macro picture in a lot of ways, like the large scale evidence for this. That's how I kind of view your work, and it's a whole different discipline and a whole different angle to a lot of the scientific work and the papers that have come out since really look at the micro evidence, because there's evidence for this on both scales. There's these nano diamonds and shock synthesized particles and all of the extraterrestrial platinum and all these little impact proxies and that are in the ground in the strata layers. There's that side of it, and those are datable because of the strata layers that they're found at, and they found it actually turns out a lot of archaeological sites that in North America in particular, but on many continents. But the other aspect to it, and where your work is really this macro evidence, the evidence for mega floods, the evidence for ice impacts. And it's just it all comes together, and that's an interesting way of putting it. So with the Carolina Bays, I kind of want to circle around. That isn't. I mean, it's almost. I consider that almost like splash damage from this impact, and it was such a tremendous impact, likely into an ice sheet, that it ejected that those bays were formed by ice. Is that you're on board with? Is that how you think about those today too, or are you
still straddling the fence? That's okay. Tony Zamora's idea, and I know Tony. We've communicated, we've hung out, and I've watched his demonstrations of how it would work.
Yep.
And what I'm going to say is it's really interesting. I'm not
Yep.
convinced yet.
Okay.
For me, I really have to wrap my head around it more.
Right.
Think about it more. I still tend to lean towards a Tunguska model because
Okay.
looking at some of the concept, and we can pull that up in a minute. I mean, when you look at the Tunguska area in the swamps below that aerial detonation,
Yeah.
there are features and forms that look very
Much.
Carolina Bay like.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and those were from atmospheric detonations and conical pressure waves
Yeah.
intersecting the surface of the Earth at an angle.
Right. Okay.
Um, I know that Tony's idea has gotten some harsh criticism from some other guys I know,
Yeah.
Malcolm LeCompte and others.
Right.
I don't know.
It's interesting.
It's an interesting idea, and it's an
Yeah.
idea that I had actually entertained, but then kind of dismissed it.
Okay.
Mainly I probably dismissed it because I was thinking I didn't have the conceptual framework and the detailed knowledge to decide whether it was credible or not.
Yeah.
This is like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I kind of put the idea on the shelf, and then I encountered Tony's work. And so that kind of brought that idea back.
Because it's super interesting to me that the way that they look at the axes for these all of the Carolina Bay, and people should know that there's, I think, millions, if not definitely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of these, not just in the Carolinas. They're also called the Missoula rainwater basins, and there was that one study that calculated that by lining up the axes, the long axes of all of these bays, and he calculated this off thousands of them, but also taking into account Coriolis effect, given that if you consider that the origin point was somewhere around Saginaw Bay, so idea, I think his idea is there's an impact there to the ice sheet, and then the ejector is essentially what caused the Carolina Bays.
I think he's referred to it as the ice boulder hypothesis.
Ice boulder hypothesis, right?
Now, as a result of becoming familiar with Zamora's work, that was the first. I didn't know about the Nebraska bays.
Nebraska rain basins, yeah.
Now that is a pretty interesting piece of evidence, and because one thing, like you were just saying, the axes of those Nebraska bays, they're oriented kind of to the northeast. So when you draw lines, they converge on the Saginaw Bay area.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't know, but it's one of those things that I think it'd be a hell of an important thing to eventually find out.
Yeah.
And what are we going to find out? We're going to find out that the Carolina, now there's some guys doing work out there that are saying, well, they're impact produced, but they were produced like 100,000 years ago.
Right. Yeah. The time frame's off. It's what George Howard calls the kooky caboose to the Younger Dryas theory. In terms, the dating of it is kind of, they're still working. Yeah. I think there's a lot of work to be done looking into the center of those. Like, is there any particles they can find at the center of these bays to prove out these hypotheses? And then there's the dating aspect, because one of the things Tony does show is that there's the flipping over of strata. Like as a result of that impact, you have older layers that end up on top of younger layers. And
that's common during impacts.
Right. Exactly.
You find that at Meteor Crater in Arizona. Yeah. Exactly the overturning.
Yeah. What seems to be certain is that they seem to be impact caused and not, wind and sand, erosion, and all the other the list of terms that I can't pronounce. Yeah.
Yeah, the Artesian solution lacustrine Aeolian hypothesis.
That one. Yeah.
That one. That's what you're trying to say, Ben.
Yes, indeed. Trying to say
that was Douglas Johnson was the dean of geomorphology. I believe it was at Columbia University. So he was considered like the big cheese of that, prestigious professor, and he led the charge against these cosmic impact heresy boys that were really led by William Prouty, who, I don't know, he might have been a professor at a 2-year college or something.
Right.
But as it turned out, Douglas Johnson's theory fell apart eventually in the 60s. I don't know if we want to get into why, but it was the solution part of his idea basically didn't hold up, and
Okay.
because in his see, very briefly,
Okay.
you had an artesian spring coming up. It's
Yep.
all limestone terrain, dipping towards the southeast
Yep.
or tilting towards the southeast. So you picture it's got this tilt, and you have the an artesian spring coming up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what's happening is that the spring is flowing along. It's a perched spring, which
Mm-hmm.
means that there's a cap rock it can't get above. It's flowing in a zone of weakness, probably between two bedding planes in the limestone. It's flowing,
Mm-hmm.
and then it gets to an aperture or conduit to the surface. So it actually creates, in a way, kind of like an upside down waterfall.
You're right.
Right
Right.
now, that's the artesian part of the theory. Now, as it's going up like this, think of a waterfall. If it's flowing over the rim, a limestone rim, limestone is carbonate rock, so it's going to
Mm-hmm.
be uh, so, it's going to dissolve in acidic waters. Okay, so going over like this, what's going to happen to this rim here? It's going to recede.
Yeah.
See, as the water eats it and washes. Well, turn it upside down, right? So now it's coming like this, but it's still receding upward.
Right.
And that creates this elongated aperture in the limestone bedrock, right? So now what you've done is there's the artesian, then the solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now lacustrine means lake.
Right.
So the water has come up and it's made a lake, a pond, a body of water. But we don't have a bay yet. We got to bring in the wind.
Right.
And that's the Aeolian.
Aeolian.
So now the wind is blowing and the waves shape the shoreline into this perfectly elegant elliptical shape.
Right.
So there it is.
Yeah.
So if anybody out there listening, if you want to impress your friends, go back. You can say the artesian solution lacustrine Aeolian hypothesis. If anybody ever brings up and wants to know about the origin of the bays, you can cite that. And if you can say all that and put it together, it'll impress the hell out of them. And after all, isn't that why we do this? To impress people?
It must be. Yeah. Yeah. I guess at the just at the barbecues and whatnot. I tend to
Yeah.
It doesn't always work out, but sometimes.
But here's the problem. Here's why it's since I went through all that, I might as well go another 20 or 30 seconds.
Yeah, please.
The reason his theory was quietly discredited and put on the shelf in the late 60s was they started doing surveys of the basins of the bays, and they discovered that in all of the basins that they looked at, you went through a layer of organic material, which was extracted and in many cases radiocarbon dated. Most of the interesting, a lot of those radiocarbon dates, in fact, the majority of them seem to be coming up in as late Pleistocene. So, which would put it right in that window of right. But the other thing is at the bottom, and I could even pull up. I have the quotes right here. I could pull up, show you some of the studies that were done, and basically under Johnson's hypothesis, there should be this elongated conduit where the water, there was nothing like you pull out all of the organic material that had filled in, accumulated since the whatever process excavated those basins originally. You pull out all the accumulated organic material, and now you had this hard packed material they called humate, and it was actually described as being almost like baked clay.
Right.
But guess what? It was solid. There was no aperture that would have been created by the solution of artesian waters in any of them.
Okay.
And so Douglas Johnson's big tome on the origin of the Carolina Bays kind of got quietly put on the shelf.
Shifted out. Yeah.
And where it was ignored. So what did that do? Well, that opened the door to a reconsideration of a celestial hypothesis.
Right.
So it's interesting.
It is. And it's not it doesn't seem to be an area that the bays don't seem to get a lot of mainstream attention or scientific. Not that I've seen. It's
no, they don't.
There's still like something of an enduring mystery as to how they formed, and they're remarkable. I mean, with modern lidar and things now, we're seeing more and more just how prevalent they are in that area too. It was a full-blown saturation bombardment. And I think it fits in the overall concept of macro evidence for these cataclysmic times that we've been through. And we spend a lot of time, and I know on your podcast you guys have been looking at some of the evidence in North America, but I know there's evidence for this catastrophic flooding all over the world. Like there's it's not
all
just
over the world.
I mean, it definitely there's I think, because of the Laurentide and the ice sheet situation in Americas, we have some very strong evidence and big signs of it, but this was a global event, and I don't know if you have some other examples of kind of the evidence for this catastrophic flood in other parts of the world, but that was another topic I wanted to ask you about.
You find that evidence of really catastrophic floods, I mean, orders of magnitude larger than anything from modern times, is found pretty much all over the world. But that doesn't mean now necessarily that it's all the same
One
flood.
Right.
First of all, I want to issue that disclaimer, because one of the reasons science has resisted this, let me say, there was the old diluvialism, which was what we found in the early 19th century up until about mid-19th century, when all of the founders of geology, for the most part, all believed in catastrophism.
Right.
Because they're looking at the landscape now without the lens of gradualist dogma.
Right.
And they're seeing, boulders that are displaced miles and miles from their places of origin. They're seeing what they call the boulder clay, which is these vast deposits of stuff that is largely now attributed to the work of glacial action. And that became sort of the idea that, well, this is how we get rid of the deluge, is we define these anomalous deposits that are in the valleys, they're on the hillsides, they're spread all over, bouldery, clay, gravel, sand, everything all jumbled together in these layers.
Yeah.
And to a large extent, it was the work of glaciers, but only about halfway. And see, what they did was they basically were able to get away from the deluge by attributing it all to glaciers.
Right.
And in those days, now we're getting to the latter part of the 19th century, when the gradualist dogmas were really pretty much taking control of
in full
the
swing.
academic. See, once geology became an academically established
discipline.
Thank you. And you had dogmas that were then contrived. And when those dogmas were created, one of the things that was high on their list of priorities was breaking science away from the biblical straitjacket.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So what you had was the classic case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
See, we're going to get rid of this deluge. So we're going to contribute all of this stuff to the work of glaciers. And now we can pretty much assume from studies of modern glaciers that we're looking at tens of thousands of years of geomorphic work, right? Whereas if it was a Noahite flood, we're looking at, 40 days and 40 nights, or
right,
and then maybe 100 days, I think, and from the whole duration of the flood. And it was one event, one universal event.
Right.
Well, you can kind of understand the motive of these guys wanting to get away from the constrictions of the biblical model.
Yeah.
So what they did, though, was they completely pushed aside any ideas of great floods. And it wasn't until J. Harlan Bretz revived the idea in the 1920s that it slowly began to work its way back into the scientific discourse.
Yeah,
even though it took 30 years.
Yeah, and he was vindicated almost on his deathbed by the time that's that famous quote from him. Is just like the only thing he regrets is that none of his critics were around to actually witness it.
He was granted the Penrose Medal.
Yeah,
which is sort of like the Academy Award of the geological profession.
Yeah.
And I think he was like, 94, 95 or something when he got that finally.
Yeah.
But his only regret was that all of his critics weren't still around for him to gloat over.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm sure, because I'm sure that's the thing. It's these anyone that in a lot of these areas, and this happens in archaeology as well too. It's the whole Clovis doctrine. There's guys that have challenged that have been laughed out of conferences, and
Yeah.
there's more and more evidence piling up now that okay, there were obvious signs of human occupation, the Bluefin caves, things like that go beyond the Clovis boundary. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, and I think in geology wasn't that there was a stated goal for something like 50 or 60 years that everything had to be explained by uniformitarianism and gradualistic processes, that the gentle erosional features that we see in process today. Was that the case? Like they would literally
Yes.
go to whatever lengths you need to explain things. And I think one of your old demonstrations you were talking, I think it was like a land gap or something, that was like you had to the sort of the hills had to rise at the same rate at which the water ate away the valley, and that's the only way that you end up with this feature. It's like this
The water gaps.
crazy water gaps, a crazy
Yeah.
convoluted explanation, when a far more elegant one is that, well, actually a big flood could have caused this.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. So, and still,
I lost you, Randall, on the video.
Uh-oh. You still hear my, okay.
I can hear you. No, you're back.
I'm back now.
Yep.
Okay. I think it was, it was that, I think it was that meteorite that went over and exploded. Interrupted our transmission
We're
here.
going to hear a loud noise in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to navigate around to show, I thought since we've been talking about the bays, we should look at a few images.
That'd be great. That's no
Okay,
big deal.
so here we go.
Gotcha. Yep.
Here we go. You're seeing that now, right?
I am. Yep. Recording.
Okay, good. All right, so here's our North American map, and I'm just going to point out that the bays, this is the coastal plain region, this dark green right here. I think okay.
Yep.
The coastal plain is pretty much sandy sediments. Almost all of that coastal plain was built through the erosion of the early Appalachian mountains, right? Which were at one time equivalent to the Himalayas, believe it or not.
Huge. Yeah.
But they have been worn down. I think the tallest ones are 6,000, maybe 7,000 feet above sea level.
Yeah.
But all of that material is essentially, the pulverized material is now forming the coastal plain of the southeastern United States. Right. And so it's not a highly lithified material. It's still basically unconsolidated. And so the bays actually show up along this unconsolidated southeast coastal plain. And then they extend down, and you see there's an area, if you can see this kind of lowland area here.
Yep.
There's a whole cluster of bays, the Georgia bays, in that area right there, interestingly. So if it was an impact, the Saginaw Basin is right up here. Isn't it right here? I believe it's, let's see.
A little east of that, maybe? I'm not sure.
No, it's here.
Yeah.
This is, I
of
think,
that.
here it is. Yeah, this is it right here. So Tony's theory is that there was an impact here, and the splash apron came down over all of this area.
And Nebraska.
And, in Nebraska out here. See, so he's showing that the rainwater basins of Nebraska, their axis is oriented towards Saginaw Bay. So, but the idea would be that even though there would have been a rain, whether it's ice boulders falling back to Earth, whether it was aerial detonations along the lines of Tunguska, the idea is that the coastal plain was the matrix that was conducive to the preservation.
Yes.
Once you get up into the Piedmont, where you've got hard, gravelly, because the Carolina Bays have been described as deflation hollows. Well, a deflation hollow is where you have a hollow in the ground that was created by wind blowing.
Right.
Blowing a sandy material out.
Yep.
And that's what you call a deflation hollow. So originally, I wouldn't say originally, but along in the controversies that went on, they were described as deflation hollows, and that the hollows originally formed from wind. Like after the collapse of Douglas Johnson's theory, There were several others. There was one guy who wrote another book in the probably mid to late 70s called The Origin of the Carolina Bays, where he attempts to explain them as a result of primarily wind.
Right.
And I read that book, I didn't buy it. But anyways, so the idea is that the bays are preserved along in here. They go as far north as Virginia. In fact, there's been a few of them scattered up even around in New Jersey. But the greatest concentration is right along here, North and South Carolina, in the coastal plain region. And they're called bays because of these trees that grow near the bay trees. They're not actual like bays, inlets in the ocean coastline. So this is, Savage, 1982. In 1930, Myrtle Beach Estates, in order to facilitate the sale of the timber from some of its extensive land holdings in Horry County, South Carolina, had engaged Fairfield Surveys Incorporated to photograph from the air some 500 square miles in the Myrtle Beach area. When the photo runs had been flown and the prints developed, a Fairchild engineer in the company's New York office, Edwin H. Corlett, noted the presence of numerous mystifying elliptical features, some small, some very large, all possessing such an amazing geometrical perfection that they seemed artificial, particularly some that seemed to be marching in rank across the wooded plain heading towards the ocean strand. And this is the mosaic that Edwin H. Corlett put together and said, "What the hell is this?" That was his exact words.
Yeah.
Documented, on his podcast at the... No, this was 1930. So this is, I think, the first aerial survey of this region. Well, it was.
Must have been.
Yeah. And the marching in rank, here's a topographic map where you can see, here's like marching in rank.
Yep.
That's that. You got to admit, that's a pretty interesting phenomena.
It really is, yeah.
Whatever caused it.
Yes, it is absolutely. It's
yeah. And see, you've got notice this one. You have no real prominent rim here, but you've got this
prominent rim on the southern side, right?
It's same here, here.
Which
almost
is
as if.
What does Tony say? Like the conical, it's like a sectional of a cone, like it's suggestive of an angular impact into the ground, not like straight down angular.
Yeah. Oh, Melton and Shriver. Yeah, they were the first to. So Corlett. Let's see. I think it was Shriver, or was it Melton? I don't remember. Anyways, they knew each other. So Corlett contacted them and said, "Hey, come take a look at this. I want you to tell me what's going on here." So he did, and he brought in one of his associates. I think Shriver was the older one, and Melton was a student, I think. I've forgotten exactly. Anyways, look at the title. The Carolina Bays, Are They Meteorite Scars? Journal of Geology back in 1933. And, they're just going into some of the background. And then this, a careful study of the photographs showed that the origin of these bays involved problems of extraordinary interest, which I would concur.
Yeah.
Salters Lake Bay, Bladen County, North Carolina. Note the peat bog encroaching upon the lake and the small bay on the northwest. And notice this bay right here. You'll see how it's the rim of the larger one overlaps the rim of the small one.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, that's very typical impact phenomena that you would see.
It's overlapping.
Because the younger of the two impacts will be the one. So, in other words, when this larger one formed, the smaller one was already there.
Yep.
If it was the reverse, then you would see the completed rim of the small one.
Yeah, and hard to correlate that with Aeolian processes.
Well,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So, okay, so there we go. This is 1 2/3 miles to give people a sense of the scale. Well, you can see the roads in here.
Mm-hmm. You should see. I don't know if you've got some of the lidar imagery that they have now. These, where it's just see
I
through
do. It's coming
yeah.
up. The Bladen
Look at
County
that.
mosaic.
That's great.
And here you can really see the
Overlapping
overlap.
bays. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And this is what I call ghost bays. So this is this is exactly what you see as you're getting up off the coastal plain, is that the bays begin to fade out. Which suggested to me, you see this right here? Like, look at this. This is what I'm calling a ghost bay. And so as you go further east up the Piedmont, they disappear completely. But they don't stop all at once. They fade out. But they're most prominent where you have the unconsolidated sandy coastal plains where an imprint would be most readily made.
Right.
So then they go on to say, referring to the sketch, one sees that the probable area of bombardment includes most of the southern Appalachians. Thus, the numerous meteorite discoveries in this region may be additional evidence of the reality of the shower, which the authors have assumed. And then, let's see here. Okay, so this was the map that was done by William Prouty in 1952. So all of those speckles are bays that he mapped. Now, in 1952, Prouty was the leader of the Celestials, the group that was arguing for some type of a cosmic bombardment or celestial impact type event. Douglas Johnson was the leader of the terrestrials.
Right.
And the complex hypothesis, which it was called for short, right? Never mind, the old adage of people like Thomas Kuhn and others that the best scientist, or even Carl Sagan or whoever, they've been saying it for years, that the best scientific hypothesis is always the simplest one.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it definitely fits in that box, this stuff.
Yeah, bays are geographically restricted to the coastal plain area between southern New Jersey and northwestern Florida, with most of the bays in the two Carolinas and northeastern Georgia.
Right.
Bays have no relationship to geological formations, geological age, or topography. Some bays are on interstream flatlands, others on valley slopes or older stream terraces, and a few on the older portion of the present floodplain of streams. So, in other words, because of the geologic and geomorphic diversity of the terrains that they're found, it becomes very difficult to invoke some type of
terrestrial process.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And here is the diagram. I think that it was Prouty that came up with this.
Yep.
Right? Here you see, and here you see this line, the fall line that heads on up. So the fall line is where it transitions from Piedmont to coastal plain sediments.
Mm-hmm.
So it was this map that I used, this basic map that I used to project onto the globe, and realized that if this was impacts coming in from the northwest, that they would have passed right over the ice sheet.
Yeah.
The similarity of development and the condition of preservation of bays in all parts of the Bay Country seem to indicate that they are all about the same age. Elliptical sand-rimmed bays are not being formed anywhere in the world at the present time, as far as known. Most bays are associated with other bays of slightly different age. These associated bays frequently overlap. And then they point out that the area to the northwest of the known Bay Country has yielded more meteorites than any other equal area in the United States.
Yeah. I think that's what they need to be doing.
From the deeper part of some of the bays in Bladen County, North Carolina, taken from beneath the peat deposits, show a thickness of several feet of light-colored silt, which, according to B.W. Wells, is of wind-blown character. The deposition of silt over the coarse bottom sand shows that the bays were formed suddenly and were soon filled with water. Then followed sedimentation from a wind-swept, barren area. And Melton and Shriver state the obvious fact that the bays, if they are of meteoric origin, must be no older than the youngest formations in which they occur. These bays clearly cut beach ridges developed on late Pleistocene terraces. And so here you've got, look at you see these kind of striation lines in here?
Yeah, that's what
Those
they're
are
talking
ancient
about.
beaches.
Okay.
And so whenever these beaches were formed, they were before the bays formed, because look, the bays are clearly juxtaposed upon them and intersect them, right?
Yes.
In other words, you don't see the beaches running
on top
through
of
the
bays. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what this is it doesn't give you any absolute dates, but it does give you a relative date. Yeah. So
very interesting.
Yeah, there we go. There's some lidar stuff now.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And gosh darn, what I forget. I'm drawing a blank here. Yeah, when we had the round table out in Carolina a few years ago with George Howard and Tony there.
Yep.
We got to see, and I should have. If I knew we were going to talk about this, I could have found the link. The man who's doing the really great work with the lidar.
Yeah,
it's amazing stuff. Yeah,
right.
But here, look at this. Here you can see the old river channels.
Yeah, yeah. Saturation bombardment, crazy.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been pleasant being around.
No, it wouldn't.
Well, and then Tony is saying that he thinks it may have been a contributor to the actual megafauna extinction in that area. Like that's, I don't think there's much that would have lived through it.
It was bombardment, whether it was Tunguska-like or ice boulders, like
Either
Tony
way.
says, it would have been profoundly catastrophic.
Yeah. Well, I think they should be. I mean, it seems like a good candidate to like go and find if it's, I mean, impact, either whether it's, I guess, aerial, like the atmospheric explosion model, you probably aren't going to have like bits of extraterrestrial material like in the center of these bays. But if you,
right.
If I'm sure, and it can't all have been that way. There might have been some that were actual impacts, and you'd think that'd be something that you could go and try and dig for and look for in the center of these bays,
you
try
would
and excavate.
Think that. But macrometeorite material has not been found, but micrometeorite material has been found in bay rims.
Yeah. Well, and are they looking for magnetic spherules and things? I think there's a.
Well, yeah, and I've got some work on that. So we'll go. Yeah, so these are and you notice here when we're looking at the Georgia bays, they're much rounder.
Yes.
You see there?
Yeah.
Now, if it would meteoritic, I would speculate that the eccentricity of the ellipses is dependent upon the angle of approach.
Right.
So, as you get more towards the perpendicular, the bays are going to get rounder.
Yeah.
Yes.
The more angular, the more elliptical they become.
Right.
Yeah.
So these are all okay. And this is let's see.
Heart Pine Pond.
I think let's see. I think this one was Arabia Swamp. I think that's what this was. This is one of those that I took from the air. And it was, by the way, it was raining.
Yeah.
So there was, on a couple of moments there that I was thinking, look, this is valuable research and I just hope I don't die.
Yeah.
This wasn't, it didn't turn out. This was my first aerial flight.
Okay.
I've done like many since then.
Right.
And most of them pretty cool. There was one, though, doing a traverse of the Snake River where it was like 40-mile-an-hour gusts.
Right.
And I did think there was the possibility of death being the outcome.
Small plane travel. It can be very exciting.
It can.
A lot more exciting than the big jets sometimes. Holy crap. I've had a few of those moments myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's good stuff.
It is. Yeah. I was going to think.
Raymond T. Cox-Zarowski. He was the one who then wrote, 1977. So 1977 now is after Douglas Johnson's book of the same title. Well, let's see. His title was The Origin of the Carolina Bays. And this was the work by this guy who I think basically said, I better step into the thing here and come up with another theory to discredit this impact hypothesis before somebody else does. Because bear in mind, in the 50s, both William Prouty and Douglas Johnson passed away.
Right.
And when they passed away, the controversy that had been raging for 25 years or whatever
Kind of went
pretty
away.
much died with them.
Yeah.
But see, he does mention here that there are, notice the wording here. He says the origin of the Carolina Bays has been something of a geological enigma since their existence in the coastal plain was first recognized in 1848. Now, this was not, they were discovered in 1948, but only seen from the ground. So
Yes.
it was not until 1930 that this aerial perspective was achieved.
Yep.
Theories that have been proposed for the origin of the bays are numerous and diverse. Now, I find this next statement rather puzzling. Surprisingly, however, most workers seem to have neglected the concept of uniformitarianism in their studies of these remarkable features. Hence, few investigations have been designed to compare or contrast the Carolina Bays with modern analogs in Alaska, Chile, and Texas. Notice I've got modern analogs underlined. Well, would that not lead you to think that, there are examples then of Carolina Bays being formed? They've got modern analogs in Alaska, Chile, and Texas.
That seems to be what he's hinting at, yeah.
Yeah, well, so I did research into the modern analogs in Alaska, Chile, and Texas, and they were all at least as old as the Carolina Bays. So this is a nonsensical statement.
Right.
Now, here, notice this strategy. Investigations of oriented lakes and bays in these different geographic areas have shown that the processes that initially produced them apparently differ. However, absolutely no evidence has been encountered that would support an extraterrestrial origin. Incipient oriented lakes develop in topographic depressions created by coastal, fluvial, Aeolian, solutioning, glacial, periglacial, and perhaps some tectonic processes. So he's gone even way beyond Douglas Johnson, right? Yeah. Now we got fluvial, Aeolian, solutioning, glacial. So, but what is that? That's explaining absolutely nothing.
It's just word soup, I guess. Here's all the possible terms and processes that could have, in some combination, might have made this. It's not. It's not really an explanation. It
is not. But notice what I've got underlined: develop in topographic depressions.
Yeah.
Well, notice that he sort of conveniently sidesteps the most important part of the whole process. So he already assumes the topographic depressions are there. Right. Well, how the hell did they get there, Raymond?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yes. Yeah. Something's got to create that depression in the first place.
Yeah. So. Exactly. He says few known impact craters on Earth or other planets could be classified as being elliptical, due to the fact that meteorites are generally believed to explode on impact, producing a spherical rather than an elliptical crater. If one therefore assumes that these craters are not spherical because the meteorites did not explode on impact, the logical conclusion would be that at least some meteorites would remain. However, no meteorite material has ever been discovered in association with any of the bays. So I've got that underlined for the simple reason that I would suggest that that's not a true statement.
Right.
And then this is how he goes on, and you can see his orientation of his thinking here. In retrospect, it is rather unfortunate that the meteorite theory ever made its way into the literature, since many laymen and even a number of geologists still subscribe to it in spite of the fact that no concrete supportive evidence whatsoever exists.
This guy could have been an archaeologist.
Now, interestingly, notice how dismissive he is, and yet he has absolutely no explanation for it to offer as a counterpart.
Yes, I do.
So,
yeah, that's kind of why I said he could have been an archaeologist, because that's kind of how they roll in a lot of ways too. Yeah. We have these processes, therefore it must have been these processes. I can't explain it using these processes, but there's no evidence for your process, so it must be my process. It's kind of like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. It's yeah.
So see, yeah, here it is
Logical
safe to
gap.
assume that daily processes
Processes.
rather than catastrophic events are more effective
Yeah.
in creating the bays, right? So it's just daily processes. And then he cites three examples of Alaska, Texas,
Chile.
and the third one calls them modern analogs, but they aren't modern analogs. They're there, they're fully formed, they're old, they're just other analogs, they're not modern. And then he performs one experiment that supposedly clinches his argument. So he sets up a stream table with sand and he blows some fans across it. And this is what he gets. Vertical view of Koczorowski's model experiment using unconsolidated sand in conjunction with high-speed fans. Now you arrange the fans in exactly the right way to blow the sand to try to get the closest approximation possible of a bay. And what you end up with, of course, looks more like a football than a bay.
Yeah, it's not an elliptical.
No. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. So I think there's fairly conclusive. Certainly a lot of evidence that suggests that there was some sort of extraterrestrial, impact related event in process in making these, and that's kind of something that I'd like to pivot to, which is given that there seems to and it's if this was a meteor storm or a shower of impacts, or even if it was an impact into the ice in Saginaw Bay, it was probably only one of many during this entire process. And humans living through this at the time, it's in a lot of ways like I think it explains our fascination with the sky in ancient cultures. I think it explains a lot of the mythology that comes down to us, like there's just the idea of danger and snakes in the sky, all that, the cosmic fire. I mean, you've been researching this topic for forever, but it's something that I like to think about is kind of the impact that it would have had on people that lived through it and somehow survived it, and how this would be remembered, and kind of how it's been transmitted culturally down to us today. Like there's, I think almost every culture has. And every religion kind of has some evidence of this in them, and it's symbolic. It's like you say, the top of the temple at Dendera. I think it comes at you from just a ton of different angles.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it absolutely does. It absolutely does, and yeah. Okay. It turns out that the next quote I've got.
Yep.
Is from 1997 from a gentleman named George A. Howard.
Okay. Yeah, actually, we should see that one for sure. Let's
see. George, here's what George says. Now, he's talking about Robert Cobras, an independent researcher in Athens, Georgia. When we were doing Fire from the Sky in 1996, I went and interviewed him because I wanted him to be a major part of that show, and then they didn't use any of his material. Which was too bad. Because the stuff I had ready to go in 1996 would have been at least a decade ahead of its time, and most of that just got edited out.
Okay.
For the 50 minutes or whatever that got shown on.
Yeah.
It was TBS and CNN that showed it.
I think that's one of the reasons why people like podcasting and they like this sort of thing, because it's you get to have the long form conversation, and in particular, like the stuff you're doing on Cosmographia is just, it's great because you get to just drill down into topics and take the time that's required to really explain it. So, yeah. What's George's quote?
Well, he says, Robert Cobras, an independent researcher in Athens, Georgia, has studied Carolina bays for nearly 20 years in conjunction with his larger interest in impact threats from space. His recent self-published investigations have profound consequences for Carolina Bay study and demand research by academia as serious, relevant, and previously unexamined new information. The essence of Kober's theory is that the search for debris and the comparison of bays with traditional impact craters falsely and naively assumes that circular craters with extraterrestrial material in them are the only terrestrial evidence of past encounters with objects entering Earth's atmosphere. To explain the bays, Cobras proposes a similar encounter, albeit of larger proportions, and more accurately described as a near miss. The Cobras event proposes that a comet, if you like, whipped past the Earth, exchanging enormous energy, but not impacting directly to form a typical crater. It is demonstrable that such an encounter would show an intense flash of heat onto the ground below. So there's another theory.
Yeah. Wow.
So Cobras goes a logical step further by assuming that forces associated with incoming bodies, principally intense heat, should also leave visible signatures on the Earth. And finally, that physics does not demand that a collision of the bodies need necessarily occur to produce enormous change on the Earth. To verify that such encounters are possible outside of the physics lab, we need look no further than the so-called Tunguska event. June 30th, 1908, in the vicinity of the Tunguska River, deep in Siberia, a tremendous explosion instantly leveled 2,000 square kilometers of tundra, felling trees by the millions. It was actually been estimated over 80 million trees.
Wow. Like matchsticks,
all
too.
left pointing outward from a central area. At the epicenter of the explosion lay not a large crater with a rock in it, as might be expected, but nothing more than a number of neat oval bogs. Now, what I want you to do is look at, I'm going to do a share screen.
Yep.
So that we can see some of these neat oval bogs.
Yeah.
Here we go. Share.
There we go.
There we go.
Huh.
Let's see here.
I see the...
You can see them out here. There's dozens of them. And let's see, I think we got some more. Yeah,
That's
here's
ground
one
zero.
here.
That's the center. Okay.
Yeah, one of the many oval crater swamps Kulik found near the epicenter. Note the forest devastation on the hill in the background. The trees splayed over. Let's see, it should be... Yeah, here again, notice.
Now, is that related to the topographical feat, like the sediment, or is it all like a consistent?
Well, it's all
ground layer.
Tundra. It's soil. A lot of it's frozen soil. But here you go. Look at this. That really looks like a Carolina Bay. One of the small, neat oval bogs that Kulik erroneously presumed to be secondary craters of the fragmented meteorite.
Interesting.
This one was named after the ethnographer Suslov. But the point is, you did not have a ground impact, you had an aerial burst.
And they produced
with
these shapes.
Shock waves with presumably conical fronts intersecting the surface of the Earth and creating formations that now... Yeah, and here you can see there's numerous of these shallow, swampy, elliptical shapes under the epicenter of the Tunguska explosion.
And that appear to be overlapping as well.
Yeah. So what's the story? I don't know. But to me, when I looked at this, my conclusion was that, gosh, this is strong evidence. Tunguska seems to provide a model.
Right.
So imagine you've got a few 100,000 Tunguska type objects. So this is the idea that I kind of latched on to.
Yeah.
I'm not emotionally attached to the idea, and I'm certainly willing to consider the ice boulder hypothesis.
But
At this point, I don't know though.
Yeah.
I'll be honest and throw up my hands and say I don't know.
Well, I haven't heard this comparison and then been walked through that you're thinking on the bays either to this extent. I'm in the same camp, honestly. Like it's what seems to be pretty clear to me is one way or the other, it's, you know, cosmically induced. There doesn't. I'm not. I really don't. I have looked at the idea, like just the formation of the sandy rims on the south side. It's one of those things that is I don't think you can explain very well with terrestrial processes. And so whether a bit, and it's gonna, you know, it's tough. It's gonna be tough to nail down specifically what it was. But yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, that's in recent times. Yeah, it's. Yeah, yeah, God, and it's evidence of just some, traumatic bloody crossover with some cosmic debris.
That's what it seems like. Yeah.
Yeah, that's epic.
Yeah, So that's kind of where my thinking is at. I mean, it goes further than that, but
I'm sure. Yeah.
But that's a good start.
Yep. It is.
And, you know, Tunguska is interesting because, you know, June 30th, 7:30 in the morning, peak of the Taurid meteor stream.
Yes. Yeah, the timing is...
Yeah, the timing, but not only that, the radiant point. Let's see, I might show you another... Yeah, here we go. Let me do another stop share, and
I was
maybe
seeing
we were
that
still seeing it. I don't know. Okay,
Yeah,
so here we go. The radiant points of various cosmic entities. So if you're standing here and we're looking to the south, here's the sun over here.
Right.
This would be at the time of the Tunguska event.
Right.
Points A, K, and Z, if you look carefully, there's K and Z, represent successive approximations of the radiant point for the Tunguska object. So as scientists gathered data, they were able to refine and get ever more accurate determinations of where exactly in the sky did this object emanate from, right? So here we're going to identify some of these. Let's see. Let's look here. So
there's the Taurids.
Here you've got a number of Earth-approaching comets. Here's Comet Halley, the radiant point. Here's some Apollo asteroids. Oh, there's the Eretid radiant. Perseids. And now look here, the Beta Taurids, the Sun. So, and Z is the most accurate determination of the point of emanation
of the.
Notice how close it is to the Beta Taurids.
Yeah,
it's coming right from that part of the sky that you would expect to see a Taurid meteor.
Right, and
it's coming exactly at the time of the year
when
that's where they would be coming from, right next to the sun, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why people didn't see it till late in its entry into the atmosphere.
Yeah, so low like that.
So for those two reasons, the timing and the placement of it is strong evidence that it was probably part of the Taurid stream.
A quick intermission from the podcast. I wanted to take a minute to introduce a new segment that I'm going to be putting in the middle of my longer podcasts like this one and at the end of my more produced videos. And don't worry, we'll get back to the conversation with Randall pretty soon here where we've got a lot more to talk about in the show. But I wanted to find a way to thank people that have gone kind of above and beyond in supporting my work and UnchartedX and the things that I'm trying to do on this channel. So what I've decided to do is add producer credits to the show for people that are supporting my work at sort of higher monetary levels. These are real credits. They're real producer credits, just like the ones in Hollywood. You can use them on your LinkedIn. You can add them to anywhere that you want to use them. I will happily verify and vouch for any of these credits. You'll be thanked in the show description itself. You'll be thanked on my website and credited as such, as well as on the audio versions of these podcasts. I'm going to try and keep this simple, and there's only going to be two types of credits in these brief donation segments. Associate executive producer credits will be for donations of $100 or more, and then executive producers will be for people that donate in $200 or more, and there are a few of those, and I wanted to take the time to thank these people individually. So if you do support me via PayPal, you want to send a note in or anything, I will read that note out and thank you individually for it. I wanted to find a way to do that for the people that have done so. So for this first segment, I'm going to go back to the start of 2021. There are a couple of people here that I wanted to thank specifically. So starting with the executive producers in amounts of $200 or more, Bob Griffin, Huge thank you to Bob Griffin. He came in with $250 recently. He didn't send in a note in the PayPal. Bob, if you want to, please feel free to send me a note and I'll read that out on a future show. But thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. Also, Anthony Steele from rebelliongaia.com came in with $218 recently. Now, Anthony, interesting guy. He's working on an indie game. It's called Rebellion Gaia. There's actually a link down in the description below for a preview of that. I think the game is coming out on Steam in May, in the next few weeks. I actually worked with Anthony. I did a few voice lines for a character in the game. It was kind of an interesting experience, my first experience doing that sort of thing. So if you're into indie games and that type of thing, check out the preview for the game. I think a free demo is coming out in the next few weeks. Also, I really wanted to thank John and Marcia over at MLE Engineering. They came in recently with a $200 support. Huge thank you to you guys. MLE Engineering, John, they've supported me in the past a couple of times, actually, so I'm incredibly grateful for the support they've shown me over the last couple of years, really. So thanks, John, and thanks, Marcia. I very much appreciate it. And now down to the associate executive level for producers that have supported me at $100 or more. I'm starting with Valerie Salazar, who came in with $104.60, and she sent in a note with the donation that reads, "Greetings from Switzerland. I'm a career scientist and huge fan of the way you present simple yet powerful observations about the evidence that has been right in front of us, but has been largely ignored or even dismissed. Keep up the great work. Cheers, Valerie." Thanks, Valerie. Very much appreciate that. I'm glad that you're enjoying the work so far. Also, Mark Hopkins from Mark Hopkins Murals and Faux Finishes Incorporated came in with $100. He wrote a note that said, "Hello Ben, big fan because your work is thorough, well-reasoned and intelligent. $100 ain't enough to cover the value I've received from your vids, etc., but it's a start. I would be interested in joining a tour of yours. Where do you post your tours and itineraries? Cheers, Mark Hopkins." And the website for Mark is hopkinesque.com. Mark, thanks very much, first of all, for that. And you can find all the details about my tours on my websites, UnchartedX.com. I have 2 trips planned this year. One is actually in August with Brian Forrester. We're going back to Peru and Bolivia. I think all of the details for that one are over on Brian's website. I'm kind of tagging along with him on this one. It's hiddenincatours.com. I'm pretty sure it's sold out. And then I've announced an Egypt trip for October 2021. And in fact, I just heard today that that's pretty much filled up, although there will be a wait list. And if you're interested in getting on that trip, it's worth joining the wait list because people do fall off and have to pull out for various reasons. So if you're able to be flexible and get on that wait list, then it's certainly possible to do. And all of the details for that trip are on my website, unchartedx.com/tour. And thanks again, Mark. Ryan Calderon has come in with $100. Now, Ryan, his website is www.pocketwriter.biz. I've got to thank Ryan because he kind of prompted me to create this segment. He literally wrote to me and said how much and how can I get a producer credit for some of your work, and it was something that I'd been thinking about for quite some time. Trying to find a way to thank people, and I hope this sort of fills that request, Ryan. It's something that it's a good idea. It's something I want to keep doing going forward. And he writes that this is an associate executive producer credit for your next podcast or show, and looking forward to it. Thanks, Ryan. So again, thanks, Ryan. Very much appreciate it. Just a couple more here. Andrew Roman came in with $100, and he wrote a note. He wrote, "Thank you for your work, Ben. I really enjoy the way you approach the topics and the guests that you bring into the discussions. I spent a few days in Cairo for work around 2001 and was able to visit Giza and the Egyptian Museum. I came away from that trip with a lot of similar questions to those you pose on your channel. Future Ben here. Just wanted to say that there's a bit of a mic snafu coming up. I bumped the mic. You'll hear a bit of interference. It lasts about 90 seconds and then it sort of corrects itself. So just be aware of that. It doesn't continue forever. Back to it. Hopefully I'll make it back to Egypt and some of the other megalithic sites one of these days after the virus that... Keep up the great work. Best regards, Drew." Thanks, Drew. Cheers. I very much appreciate it. Yeah, I hope you get back to Egypt sometime soon as well. It's very much worth going, and it's not going anywhere. But, sooner is better with Egypt. I think with the reduced tourist numbers, it's still a very good opportunity to visit the place. And so lastly, we're going to finish up with Toby Young, who came in with $100 as well. Toby wrote in, "Hi Ben, my name is Toby, 62 years old, degree in physics and 40 years experience in telecoms, UK based. I really appreciate your work and I really appreciate your work and methodical approach to this difficult subject. I respect people like you who will carry the flag forward as some of the pioneers begin to fade away. I was with Brian Forrester in Egypt last year, and I'm in Peru with him this November, hopefully. One question I keep struggling with is not if an ancient high-tech civilization existed in prehistory, but how did they develop their technology? We progressed through steam, coal, oil, electric, nuclear, and solar power to achieve our level of tech. When we dug for coal, it was there. Drill for oil, it was there. Mine uranium, it is still in the ground. So what path did our ancient high-tech ancestors take to develop their tech? Why is there no space junk in orbit from pre-1957? If I can help you research anything, I'm happy to offer resource. I'm retired and need a project. Thanks, Toby. Well, thank you very much for the support, Toby. I very much appreciate it. It's a very good point. In fact, I have a couple of my earlier podcasts where I talk about technology and kind of our approach to technology. I kind of classified a electromechanical approach to problem solving, and our technology has definitely developed along certain lines. And I've talked about it in a few different podcasts, but I think that it's certainly possible for technology to have developed along other lines, and that may be what we're looking at with some of these examples in the past, sort of a more organic technology level. The example being, say, as we go into space, we make spacecraft made out of lightweight composite materials because we need them to be lightweight, but assuming over time, if you can conquer forces like gravity, the fundamental forces of nature itself, eventually your spacecrafts might start looking like, small planets or small moons that can contain an atmosphere that can generate their own gravity, things like that. So, it's always important, I think, when we look at this stuff from the past to try and keep the blinkers off and understand that some of the answers to this may be technology that exists out of our current understanding that may have progressed along a whole different path. But it's a great comment, and thank you again for the support. I do want to also say that, so anyone that does support me in amounts of $50 or more, if you leave a mailing address or a posting address, I'll send you one of these. It's a die-cut sticker. I do this fairly frequently for also those of you that support me through the value for value model, signing up through Patreon, Subscribestar, the channel memberships. I also do mail outs. I've just done one for all of those platforms. I do those fairly frequently, a couple times a year. I'll send out merch to everybody that supported me there. So I greatly appreciate support. The value for value model is the only way that I can kind of spend the time to make and edit all of these videos, and I'm very much appreciative for it. It might just be subscribing and liking to the videos, leaving a comment. It all helps. And you can find all of the ways to do that. It's all outlined on my website. It's unchartedx.com/support. Now, back to the podcast and enjoy the rest of my conversation with Randall Carlson. So one of the most interesting parts of all of this to me is how, like, comets and the cosmic environment. We have all this evidence today of cataclysm, of just upheaval times that happened through the Younger Dryas, potentially even earlier than that. We know that from the age of our own species that's gotten older and older, that humanity has lived through this. Like, we had our ancestors, definitely it dinged our population, but we lived through it, and this would have been a super traumatic event. And it's just an area that's of interest to me is how this is recorded and remembered and commemorated in a lot of ways in traditions, in religions, in cultures. And I think we see the echoes of that down through time, down to today's times even. Although we in some cases just dismiss it as myth and legend and nonsense in the same way that you talked about with the shift away of geology from catastrophism, the biblical sense, towards this more scientific approach. But in some cases it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because given the proliferation of modern scientific evidence that supports this, we can kind of look back at some of those tales and make a bit more sense of them, I think. Now, do you have any particular examples of this that you think really... I do. Yeah?
I will mention that, in the archaic times, in the ancient world, those people who were thinking about such things were profoundly catastrophists.
Right.
And then we see that the founding fathers of modern geology, from Georges Cuvier, William Buckland, Adam Sedgwick, Roderick Murchison, Alexander Humboldt, the list goes on and on and on. They were all catastrophists.
Really?
Right? Yeah, they all were. And then you had the rise and dominance of gradualist dogma, uniformitarianism, between the mid and late 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, it had come to be pretty much the dominant paradigm.
Right.
And so now we're I think of it as the new catastrophism. We are going back and we can actually reread and relook at some of the observations and reflections and thoughts by some of these early geologists who were looking at landscapes and seeing them as the end product of catastrophic events. And we can also now look back at the archaic world and their traditions that have come down to us in the form of myth and legend, and now begin to recognize the catastrophism, the actual plausible catastrophism that's contained there. And so we are now in this really interesting phase of this emergence of this new catastrophism. So we've got ancient catastrophism, then we have catastrophism from the founding days of geology in the 19th century. Then we had a century of dominance of uniformity and gradualism. Then starting in 1980 and the 80s and the 90s, we've had this accelerating body of evidence that is forming the framework for a new catastrophism.
Right.
I will mention, though, that as we're learning more and more and more about the history of catastrophic climate change on Earth, and that we see that catastrophism has been an integral part of global change processes on any time scale that we can measure.
Yeah.
At the same time, there are now mountains of data and evidence of observations, empirical data as well as theoretical data, that support the idea of a very dynamic history of this planet. At the same time that is happening, the discussion in the mainstream media and in the political circles and so on has degenerated into the exclusion of all that.
Yes.
And the focus only on the anthropogenic element of climate change, of global change.
Right.
Which is too bad, because now what's happening is so much of what we're talking about, the average person that is totally, you talk to anybody, everybody's heard of global warming and climate change. Well, what does that mean, climate change?
Yeah.
Right? Well, we've been indoctrinated to think now of climate change as being this exclusive thing that only happens because humans are burning fossil fuel. Right? So what has happened now is we're neglecting this whole dimension. And this is why it's so important that you and I are having this conversation right now. Yeah. And that we have this conversation, and because of the fact that it's being neglected. It's not being put out there in the mainstream media. Every month there's new scientific evidence proving over and over and over again the dynamic and catastrophic nature of global change, and it's not getting the mainstream
press. Yeah, it's right. It's you're exactly right. There's not. It's what I would. I mean, it's not a facetious way of putting it, but I think that's anybody that wants to talk about climate change has to look at the historical record of the, and as you say, the dynamic history of actual, and like I says, I'm not being facetious when I say this, but actual climate change is what happened in the late Pleistocene and in that period before it. And I mean, we don't. That's how you put this into context. Like those are the threats that we should worry about. And it's George Howard. I love the way he phrased this, which is like we're sitting in a car that's sitting on a railway track, and we're arguing about what channel the radio is on, and the train's coming. Like that's a that's the analogy. Yeah, we don't. You can argue all day about whether or not there's actually an impact from anthropogenic sources or not, but it pales in comparison to the type of thing that the planet has gone through as a result of the cosmic environment, or even extreme volcanism, or these other sources, right? And the sun can be part of that. There's, as you say, all this science coming out that shows that there's this so much more to it that what's happened in the past, but it just doesn't hit the mainstream narrative.
Yes, and yes again. Yeah. And we keep hearing now about the climate crisis that we're in the midst of, right?
Yeah.
We have a hurricane, a strong hurricane, a couple of them happen a year. Like, we pretend that this has never happened before.
Right.
But the actual evidence shows it's happened over and over and over again.
And
there's nothing unprecedented. So when we talk about climate crisis, I want to show this graph, if I may.
Yes, please.
That I think really exemplifies climate crisis, what we might really mean about climate crisis. So I am going to do a share screen. And we'll do this graph right here. Let me enlarge it.
Yes,
and here we go. Oxygen isotopes in Greenland. So let me quickly, I love to present this graph, and I've presented it many times. I presented it on Rogan's show.
Yeah.
But we'll look at it here for the sake of consistency. Relative oxygen isotope ratios. I won't go into that because I only got a minute. But as you go into the larger negative numbers, you're getting that's the implication of colder weather.
Yes.
It's the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16, heavy oxygen to light oxygen, because during warmer times, you have much more energetic evaporation from the oceans. It transports more heavy oxygen. In colder times, you have a suppression of the heavier oxygen, and so you have this diminishing ratio. So this graph here is the Holocene.
Yes.
0 is present, 10 is 10,000 years ago.
Yep. You can see.
And what you see when you look at this graph, the magnitude of these changes varies between about 2 and 4 degrees. So look, like you see this little spike right here?
Yeah.
That's about 2.5 to 3 degree spike
Shift.
in temperature.
Yeah.
Right? So what you see from this graph is constantly oscillating climate. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for 10,000 years. Get back right here. This is an interesting little excursion right here. This was the 8,200 to 8,300 year cold snap. Now, it looks pretty insignificant within this graph. If this was to happen right now, that graph, that cold right there, could spell the end of modern civilization.
Yep. Famine.
Why?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about a century here where the average global temperature has dropped by 4 or 5 degrees.
Yeah, that's huge.
What's that going to imply in terms of agriculture? What's that going to imply in terms of crops? What the implication of this right here is you've got decades of period where you're going to have multiple agricultural collapse events.
Yeah.
And that's going to lead to famine. Famine is going to lead to pestilence because people's immune systems get weak. Now you have opportunistic diseases. Okay. So this could qualify as a climate crisis right here.
Yeah.
Right. Now look what happens as we get down here. We see that the graph is trailing off to the left at about 10,000 years ago. This is 1,500 meters down core.
Yes, in the
right.
ice
So we're
core.
getting way down there in the ice. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this graph. We've shown here, we won't have time to get into this now, but this is showing alternating warm and cold spells. It's showing how culture and civilization advanced during the warm periods and regressed during the cold periods.
Yeah, people don't realize things like the Renaissance warm period.
Right.
So, yeah.
Now I'm going to bump this graph down into the late ice age so you can see what a real climate crisis looks like.
Yeah, it's a fantastic graph.
It is. Look at that. That's right. Now, what does this mean? I mean, how long do you think our modern civilization would survive through this?
Yeah, not very long.
No. Now, what they're trying to get us to believe is that somehow by adding 1 molecule of carbon dioxide per 10,000 molecules of air is going to cause a climate catastrophe.
Yeah.
Right? When all it really is doing noticeably is driving a greening of the earth. We've got forests proliferating. We have, the sub-Saharan Africa beginning to green. The bulk, the bulk biotic material on the planet has increased about 20% when it was supposed to be going the other way.
Right.
But
Yeah.
aside from all that, which is a whole discussion we could and should have,
We should. Yeah.
We've got this to contend with. And we don't have an explanation for this. But we darn sure ought to come up with some kind of an understanding of what's going on here, because this is a natural dynamic here.
It is,
now,
yeah.
Yeah. What's driving this? If we don't know, and we don't know, don't tell me that the science is settled. Don't tell me that the debate is over. No, I will say to you that the debate is barely getting started. So don't try to shut down this discussion, because we need to have this discussion. It's important.
Yeah, it puts all of this into context. It really does. And it's unfortunate that the science and the study of this gets so politicized and driven by agendas and money ultimately, right? It's all about there's the whole carbon credit, setup of exchange. It becomes this political, money-driven argument about control, and unfortunately that seems to be the case for so much of modern mainstream media. And the whole CO2 thing, I think I do live in hope that that whole CO2 forcing thing will go out the window. I think it's starting to in some of the leading institutions in science. I think that IPCC 2022 report, when they start to allow the influence of the sun. On these effects, it's going to really diminish the importance of the CO2 model. But at this point, there's so much political and mainstream weight behind it that they're going to continue with it. I mean, not for nothing, but back when the planet supported the largest life forms it ever has in the Jurassic period, I mean, the CO2 levels were far higher, and when the planet was far warmer, and everything was fine. Life was blooming on this planet everywhere, like megafauna, megaflora. It's not warming and CO2
per million.
Exactly. Yeah, warming and CO2 isn't. It's not the devil. Like, it's not. And slight. It's cold is the issue for civilization. And
cold, and that was in that graph that I showed. I mean, yes, cold has been detrimental to civilization.
Yes, definitely.
Warm means
good.
You've got a longer growing season.
Yeah.
You've got copious rainfall. You're growing a lot more food. And this is why we can see the transition from the so-called Dark Ages, which was a cold period, into the medieval warm period, when the Vikings were colonizing and farming western Greenland. And in Europe, you had the birth of this tremendous, the Gothic flowering, where all of the great cathedrals were built during the warmest 2 centuries of the last 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. The reason is that there was abundant food, and compared to people in 2 or 3 centuries earlier, during the cold of the Dark Ages, right?
Right.
What happened? You had increased lifespans. You had actual increased stature of people. You had reduction in infant mortality.
Yeah.
Right? The agricultural surpluses caused an increase in population that enabled the amassing of the labor force to build these tremendous, works of divine art.
Yes.
And then you can actually see the progression of the Gothic movement. All of a sudden, within about a decade, it all pretty much comes to an end between around 1320. What happened? 1320, 1314 to 1340 was the onset of the first phase of the Little Ice Age. A series of agricultural collapses brought on weakened immune systems, opportunistic diseases, and guess what happened after 2 decades of global cooling? The bubonic plague.
Yes.
Yeah. And third, the population of Europe were piled up as corpses within a year or two. Yeah. And that, my friends, is a real pandemic.
This is true. Yes, this is very true. There's a historical context to all of this, and I think that's the study of what's happened before is super important, and it's the thing that gets forgotten the most. I feel like in a lot of the modern narrative and the mainstream media, it's not.
Well, this is why
very frustrating.
I am so opposed to the canceling of history.
Yes.
Because look, we learn as much from the warts in the historical narrative as we do everything else. And okay, if so right here in Decatur where I live, the whole time I've been here for 30 years, right in downtown on the square, there's a statue of a seated Thomas Jefferson writing in his notebooks.
Yeah.
Right? That got taken away within the last year.
Really?
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm sorry, but that pisses me off.
Yeah, it pisses me
off
too.
Was Jefferson perfect? Well, no, but he was a man ahead of his time, but he was also a man of his time.
Yes.
He comes there on the tail end of thousands of years of slavery being an accepted part of most cultures, all cultures almost, right?
Well, every culture's enslaved. You go back far enough, every group of people has enslaved everyone else.
And again. Right. Yeah. Native Americans enslaved each other. Native Americans enslaved blacks. There were blacks that enslaved Native Americans.
Yeah, the Barbary pirate trade, right?
Yes. Slavery is a horrible thing.
It still happens.
What you had was a generation of people in the late 1700s into the early 1800s that were laying the groundwork. Nobody's going to be able to come along with a magic wand and say, slavery be gone, and it's instantly gone. It took multiple generations to get from the idea of the worth of the individual, right?
Yeah.
To the idea that from the worth of the individual follows the idea that nobody has the right to own somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And that's an idea that's not going to just materialize because some, virtue signaler decides, hey, this is a bad thing. No, it took generations. And, originally Jefferson wanted to have an anti-slavery clause in the Declaration. Well, that got shot down because of the fact that there was a bigger fish that had to be fried, which at that point was independence from Great Britain. Mm-hmm. And in order to get that independence, you had to have the full support of all the colonies. So it was a trade-off. Was it the right trade-off? I don't know. We can argue that. But if you suppress that history, well, now that argument can never be made. And we won't know the process, how we got from there to here.
Yeah. He was part of the generation that ended this process. I mean, there's and it's not, this is one aspect of a far more symptomatic issue, which is the modern trend of applying, and no doubt, like thinking and a lot of these concepts have gone forward in the intervening hundreds of years since those times, but you simply can't take those modern values and modern times and apply them to your grandfathers, to the times of Jefferson, because the fact is that as progressive as you may be today, had you been born back in those times, in those circumstances, in a human body that lived in those times, you would have gone in exactly the same direction as everybody else. You would have. I mean, these are products of societies and time and civilization, and you just, as you say, we learn as much from the warts of these things. And this gets to the bigger problem that I have with the whole cancel culture, censorship in general. What universities in a lot of cases have turned into with this, the idea that we're all about diversity, but as long as you agree with me, then that's the only diversity we'll tolerate. I think it's a big problem because, I mean, you're supposed to be able to face challenging ideas and debate them honestly, because that's how you refine thinking. That's how we move ideas forward. You can't, there's that, you can't just shut down these ideas and change the pictures of history, because you'll end up repeating them simply by trying to enforce these mandates in a lot of ways.
Right.
Yeah, so I agree. I think it's a big problem, and it's one that extends to so many fields. There's climate, there's society in general, but it's and the whole mainstream media machine sort of feeds it, and it's turned into this propaganda engine that it just.
Oh yeah.
I think there's more and more people are waking up to that and stepping away from sort of those mainstream sources. So. Yeah, I hope so.
I mean, we really, we need to get away from that.
Yeah.
There's no, we don't need to be afraid of ideas, even if those ideas turn out to be wrong. but that's a, we talk about well, look, if we can't have debate,
Right.
then there's no such thing as democracy. Is just a farce.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
It is. It's just a farce.
Yeah. The answer to speech that you don't like is more speech. It's
more speech.
It's like
exactly.
arguing. That's you hoist them on their own petards. Like it's not a. That's the answer.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to then to cancel it, to change it, to take down statues and do all this. It's this trend of historical revisionism that is going on is disturbing, and I have the
very
same.
disturbing.
And I think any true student of history would probably find it fairly disturbing too. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, like you said, it's the politicization of this, and climate change is the perfect example of where, if you raise some of the obvious questions and glaring contradictions in the prevailing narrative, the typical response is, "Oh, you're a climate change denier."
Yeah.
Or I've been called multiple times, he's a climate change denialist.
Yes, that's right. You
Like,
get labeled.
Where have I ever?
Yeah.
And I certainly, and have said on Joe Rogan several times, look, carbon dioxide can induce climate change. It's one variable in a very complex equation.
System. Yeah.
But I think in the final analysis, it will turn out to be one of the less important. And we can get into having a discussion about the whole issue of what happens with thermal capture in the 14 to 17 micron window with an enhanced carbon dioxide. We can talk about the feedbacks that were put into the models in order to ramp up the effects. All of that. Yeah.
All about the computer models. Like this is all all of this science. It's all based on ultimately faulty computer models. If you want a summary of the whole thing, like that's where it is.
You are exactly right, Ben. It's all based on computer models, which in retrospect appear to be largely faulty.
Yeah.
And this is why there has been such a divergence, what's called the divergence problem. Yeah. And the divergence problem is the actual raw data of temperature change compared to the projection of 20 years ago.
That's right. And then there's been an adjustment. Like there's been they have, I mean, there's so, we can get, it's a whole other topic of how, cool the past and warm the present. I mean, there's been adjustments from the raw data of actual thermometer readings to match trend lines based on these projections of computer models, and it just doesn't match reality. And at this point, we're so far away from what actual science is that it's just, it's crazy. And as you say, the whole thing's politicized to the point where I always find it amusing to have to point out to somebody that the second you claim to say that, okay, well, this climate crisis doesn't exist. I mean, forget the fact that they've been using teenagers and 12-year-old girls to then say, oh, you're attacking a child if you disagree. But you always have to. This is how the thinking it's been ingrained in people, that you have to clarify that this doesn't mean that I am pro pollution. It's like as soon as if you don't think the climate crisis exists, then you must be for pollution. Like this is absolute garbage. Two separate topics. Like who would think that? I look after the earth. We need like we shouldn't be polluting it. We shouldn't be all of this shit. Yeah, it drives me absolutely crazy.
How many times have I seen that and had that claim made against me? You're for pollution. And then of course, going back to the Obama years and the Obama EPA redefining carbon dioxide as
a pollutant. Yeah.
If that is, then what about oxygen? What about every substance necessary for life on Earth? Yeah. We can call anything pollutants then.
We can, CO2 is not a pollutant. That's funny. It's like I think it's all where they're working towards to put a tax on breathing. It's like
that's what because every exhale we do, we're breathing out carbon dioxide. We are carbon dioxide producing machines. We take in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
But look, plants take in carbon dioxide. Look, carbon dioxide. You got a carbon molecule, two oxygens. Photosynthesis uses the carbon molecule and one oxygen molecule, and then it releases that additional oxygen molecule into the atmosphere. So without photosynthesis, the atmosphere would soon be depleted of oxygen.
That's right.
Yeah. And, we're at 400 parts per million. Big deal. Look, if you go figure, like you said, for most of history, 1,200 to 7,000 parts per million, right? And life seemed to proliferate.
Yeah.
But on the other end of the scale,
we're much closer to the other end of the scale.
To a couple of hundred parts per million, we're getting dangerously close to the point at which photosynthesis starts to shut down.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's an issue. Well,
let's just look at one last thing because we'll leave it there because this is so I will go here because this was the other topic which we won't have really time for, but
sure.
We will get to it anyway a little bit just to show that there's this other side of the evidence.
Yep.
Statue of Zeus hurling a thunderbolt.
Mm-hmm.
Statues in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens dates from circa 450 BC. So that's right around the time, not long after Solon returned to Athens.
Yeah. With his
from his sojourn in Egypt and brought back the story of Atlantis, which was destroyed by a thunderbolt.
Indeed.
Yep.
They come from the sky.
Yeah. Yeah, there it is. And we can go in. We've got a lot of stuff here we can get into.
Yes.
Juicy stuff, ancient eyewitness accounts.
Comet drawings from China, yeah.
Yeah. Really good stuff.
Butterbuck,
just the traditions in general. Iron Age spear made out of meteoric iron and with these types of carvings on it.
Mm-hmm.
Notice the swastika there.
Yeah.
And then go back and look at some of the cometary forms from China. There it is. Look at that. See that? This would be a rapidly spinning comet nucleus throwing out jets of volatile gases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'd see that coming for a little while.
Yeah. And then we have things like this that is really interesting discussion that we can have in the future sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to.
This is hidden. I mean, this is actually right out of the Masonic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Father Time plaiting the long hair of this weeping maiden who's holding the Grail cup in one hand in the form of a ciborium and a sprig of acacia in the other hand, weeping over this book which is placed on this broken column.
Crumbling.
Father Time holds
a
scythe, and right down here is the hourglass. It's all right here.
It is.
First of all, remember what the word cometa means from where we get the word comet. What does it mean, Ben?
I don't know.
Cometa, long-haired.
Okay. Cometa.
Long-haired. Because so many comets gave the appearance of having long hair streaming. See?
Mm-hmm.
Here we have the long hair. So, yeah, comets in ancient cultures. And I have tons of stuff on this.
Yes. Yeah, we should definitely dive into this let's do another one. And I think this would be a great topic to get into.
Yeah.
So I think this is fascinating.
Buddha. Look what he's holding.
The hourglass.
The thunderbolt, the symbol of cosmic power.
Yep.
Same thing that Zeus is hurling, right?
Yep. Okay.
So, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. And it's interesting that, and this is the last little anecdote. Years ago, I was giving a lecture on how important I was talking about impact events and how important they were and all of this. And I made several references to they were important to ancient cultures, and it's likely that there were periods of enhanced bombardment in ancient cultures. And one young critic stood up and said, well, if what you're saying is true and there was all of these bombardments and it was so important that it affected their religion and everything like that, where's all the evidence for that? I said, well, okay, you got a couple of days here.
Yeah.
And well, let's see. The show that I just was pulling up here which could easily be double what it is now, has 226 slides in it.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's the documentation. But see, here's the thing. You've got to understand the language in which these traditions were preserved.
That's right.
The language of symbolism, right?
Yes.
And the accounts and so forth. If you don't understand that, you're going to miss it. So that's a big part of, some of what this research is let's look at how the ancient world experienced this, how they envisioned it,
yes.
how they talked about it, and, how they expressed the record and so forth. So that's the conversation that one needs to have. Right. Then once you've had that and you begin to understand the symbolical language, you go, oh my God,
it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It suffuses the whole ancient world all over.
Yeah,
you're right. And of course, we know without question, people all over the ancient world were obsessed with watching the sky.
That's right.
Well, there may have been multiple reasons, but I think we could easily say that one of the most important, if not the most important, was the simple fact that disasters were frequently visited from the sky. And, this will be the last thing, I promise.
It's all good.
Think about how these ideas are embedded in the very language we use, right? Think of disaster. The root of that is aster.
Right.
Aster. That's like saying, so disaster comes right there, right at the center of the word. It's the star, right?
Mm-hmm.
Disaster would actually imply two stars, right? Look at the word catastrophe. Same thing. The root of the word catastrophe, star. And then we look at the traditions about stars falling to earth. Yes. And the stars fell onto the earth as fig leaves shaken from a fig tree in a mighty wind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so they use metaphor, but that's what it's
not
talking
literal.
About.
That's when you talk about with symbolism, it's not literal. It becomes deified and personified and part of stories and traditions, and that's how we remember the data. It's just like we wouldn't remember it through generations if it was a purely literal tale. Like and there's knowledge in all of these things. You're right. I mean, I think back to the old saying of like the sky falling in. I mean, that was always it was an old saying that's come through many cultures of like that's. The end of the world was, the sky's going to fall in. It's like that's where it comes from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's no end of it in architecture. I mean, the Mayans and it's on pyramids.
Right.
The cosmic serpents. I mean, it's all
cosmic. And boy, this is something we can dive into.
Definitely.
And to me, the most really exciting development, though, is that there seems to be a network of independent researchers coming together right now as we speak that are all looking at different aspects, different dimensions, different perspectives of this overall phenomena. And over the next few years, I think we're going to see a real cross-pollination of some really exciting ideas. And these are ideas that really critically need to get out there and become part of the mainstream discussion.
Yeah.
And I see, maybe a dozen podcasters now that are instrumental in that. Hopefully we'll bring a lot of those guys in under the umbrella of HowTube, and we'll really be able to begin that dialogue that needs to happen and come up with creative ways of getting this story out there, because it's an alternative narrative to this whole thing we're being spoon-fed by mainstream media.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and it's one that gives, I think, a lot of context, and it helps fill in a lot of gaps and helps people, I mean, almost live your life and find your place in a lot of ways too, as a human. The mainstream narrative is just this very short-termed vision that's just driven by political goals. But other than that, this was wonderful, and hopefully, I have the same hope that I think there's a rising tide of a lot of these people coming together with these ideas, and I agree that all of this stuff has to come out to the mainstream. So, this has been great, Randall. Thank you so much for your time once again. And as you say, we've sort of scratched the surface on a couple of things here. I'd love to get back in and touch on a couple more of them in the future. That'd be great.
Well, and there's such a mass of material here, and we will be exploring a lot of this in depth on the Cosmographia podcast. Yeah.
Yep.
So
people check
I
that
would
out.
highly encourage people to come over. And if you go back to the first episode and start listening, we're building a case methodically, like you said, episode by episode, trying to lay out the whole broad framework of this shifting paradigm with enough detail in it that one can really begin to see the animal that's emerging, the entity that's coming out of, because a lot of researchers were putting these we're putting down these dots.
Yep.
And that's been going on for a while.
Yes.
But now we're in the stage where we can start connecting those dots. And what we're going to discover remains to be seen. But whatever it's going to be damn exciting.
Indeed. Yes, I think it will. I agree.
All right, man.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for your time. We'll do it again.
My pleasure,
Look forward to
Ben.
seeing you again. Cheers, Randall.